Good evening, everybody. Hi. Welcome to Delphina. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Sarah Philp. I'm the Deputy Director here. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you here this evening to hear our Brooks Fellow and Delphina resident, Bruno Alves de Almeida.
That was great.
And Curator for Communities from Tate St Ives, Georgina Kennedy, in conversation about Bruno's research fellowship and his time in residency here at Delphina, but also at Tate St Ives as part of the Brooks Fellowship Programme, which is really generously supported by Elizabeth and Rory Brooks and by Tate. And it's so lovely to have Elizabeth here and so many of our Tate colleagues and friends. Bruno's been looking at residency programmes specifically in the context of St Ives, but obviously as someone who helps run a residency programme, I'm really interested and excited to hear what he and George have to say. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over. If you need somewhere to sit, there's some seats here. Over to you two.
Thank you. We're speaking to these.
Yes.
This? Yeah? Good? Everyone can hear me? Good? Yeah. Hi everyone. It's really lovely to be here. I've come up from Cornwall today. I'm normally based in St Ives. And actually, I swear I wanted to start with that because I was just walking along the road this evening on my way here, reminding myself of how busy it is and how this idea of being in the centre, being in an urban environment is so very different to being in Cornwall and being in St Ives. And I think it's good to remember that and to acknowledge that there are many different forms of centre, or there's multiple meanings of this idea of centre. And Bruno will speak to this idea of being on the edges, but also when you live in the edges, you see that as your centre. And I think I bring that tonight, even though we're here in this very urban setting, that I think you'll be reminded behind me, the images, the loggia outside Tate St Ives, and this is kind of our centre where we live and work. So to speak to Tate St Ives for a moment, we look after the Barbara Hepworth Museum and Sculpture Garden, as well as the Tate Gallery there. And our programmes explore modern and contemporary art in the unique cultural context of St Ives, and that's known for the role it's played in mid-20th century modernism. And we kind of continue to celebrate and to reevaluate those histories through our programmes by applying that same spirit of internationalism and experimentation that made St Ives kind of known for the work of the artists that lived and worked there. We are the only Tate site to have always had some form of artist residency programme since we opened in 1993. And we're now in the process of developing a building called the Palais de Danse. And that was a building that is very close to the Hepworth Museum. It's right opposite. And it was brought by Hepworth in 1961 for her to use as her second studio. And it's laid kind of mostly unused since her death. So the Palais, which Bruno will speak to, it provides us with a unique opportunity to establish a kind of site for cultural exchange, but as a kind of hub of creativity for our community. And that's what provides the context for the research that Bruno is going to share tonight. And the fellowship is positioned to be mutually beneficial to both the researcher and the organisation. So as we work towards opening the Palais to the public, what we really wanted for us, for the organisation, from the research, was to interrogate the current frameworks that we use for our residency activity by connecting and learning from broader communities of practice beyond St Ives, beyond our location. And we wanted to explore models that were in parallel contexts. They're not necessarily the same as us, because I don't think anywhere else is the same as us, but that speak to us in some way. And also models that specifically embed socially engaged practice, community building, and senses of placemaking at their heart. So that's kind of our question, our proposition for Bruno. What can we learn from communities in other places to help us as we move forward? And I'm going to pass to Bruno to hear a kind of overview of the research that's taken place in the last 6 months.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming. It's super nice to see many familiar faces and many faces that I don't know yet, and I'm happy to meet throughout this evening. Can you all hear me well? Okay. So this is pretty much research in process. Many ideas are here in metabolism, while others are not here, and I'm still dealing with that lack, but I had to reduce it as much as I could. So this just to say that it's more of a conversation starter rather than, me bringing finished certain knowledge to you all. And thank you, George and Sarah, for the introductions. So artist residencies are often imagined as retreats, but in this talk, I will approach them as systems of exchange. So as formats where artists, institutions, and the communities around them might enter into a reciprocal relationship. So I borrow the term symbiotic and site-symbiotic from Hobida, one of my case studies. And the term comes from biology, and it literally means living together. And while symbiosis is always relational, it isn't always harmonious. So it can involve tension, negotiation, and friction. So instead of asking how artist residencies can respond to a place, what I'm asking is more, how can they allow institutions to form reciprocal relations with the social political realities around them? And in doing so, potentially enlarge, broaden artistic and curatorial practice. And this question feels to me urgent at a time when institutions are facing increasing scrutiny about their relevance, and at the same time as artists expand their practices across social, spatial, and political terrains. So can the residency format offer structures that strengthens art's civic role beyond the boundaries of the art world? I believe the answer is more complex than simply pushing art beyond museum walls or letting it dissolve into social work. And my interest lies in the threshold between these spheres, where institutional, civic, everyday life can meet and potentially influence one another. My earlier work in São Paulo engaged with these in-between spaces, exploring the thresholds between public and private, and between cultural institutions and urban life. In recent projects, I've continued to explore these ideas, working with notions of situatedness, relationality, and liminality, which are concepts that also underpin this research. Museum advisor Elaine Gurian speaks of threshold fear, the spatial and psychological barriers that quietly shape who feels welcome in cultural institutions. Yet thresholds can also be generative spaces, what architect Stavros Stavridis calls mediating spaces, where different worlds meet, negotiate, and reconfigure one another. So how might institutions cultivate thresholds as spaces of reciprocity? And could residencies be one of the formats through which this becomes possible? Working as a curator of an international residency in the Netherlands has shown me how residencies naturally inhabit these thresholds. They blur boundaries between life and work, the professional and the personal. Artists become temporary co-inhabitants of an institution, but also of a place. And as that line softens, they begin hosting others in return, neighbors, collaborators, and communities. At a moment when institutions around us are rethinking how they host, both the artists and the publics, residencies might offer space to explore hospitality differently. Residencies also hold a threshold between artistic process and public presentation. Their slower, more uncertain tempo often clashes with the pace that is accelerated of cultural institutions. So could we see residencies as sites of temporal resistance that reclaim this slow, open-ended, and even unproductive time as essential to artistic thinking? And because residencies make artistic process visible, they invite us to rethink the role of the audience as well, not as spectators, but as participants in the unfolding of artistic process. Philosopher Jacques Derrida uses the term parergon to describe what surrounds a work, the frame, the context, the conditions we usually don't see. And in a way, residencies bring this parergon, which is very difficult to pronounce, into view, the conversations, relationships, and material realities that shape the work. So how might recognizing this expanding frame transform the way institutions engage with publics and the way publics engage with art? When residencies allow artists to return and stay longer, the place itself becomes an interlocutor and not just a backdrop. So, how can residencies nurture deeper, longer-term engagement with the place, resisting the fragmented logic of short funding, for example, or shifting institutional priorities? And could they act as sensing membranes, helping institutions stay attuned and responsive to the realities around them? Many questions that I think catalyzed the discussions that we had throughout this residency, and to which I don't bring any definite answers, but maybe the case studies that I bring might open up some possibilities. So the Palais de Danse is a powerful lens to explore these questions because it's a site layered with meaning. For much of the 20th century, it was a social hub in St Ives. First, it was a cinema, then a dance hall, and as George said, later it was Barbara Hepworth's sculpture studio. Recent community consultations revealed a deep sense of emotional ownership of the Palais, not only amongst the arts-engaged residents, but also across the wider community. And Tate's underlying vision is to reimagine the Palais as a shared civic space, one that balanced this artistic legacy and life with the communal significance. And this vision doesn't start from scratch, but actually builds on the long-standing legacies of engagement between Tate St Ives and its local context through, for example, the community consultation process for the museum's extension led by Mark Osterfield, who is sitting there and who could give many presentations only about that process. So I'm not going to go more in depth on that, unfortunately. But this reciprocal relation between institution and communities has also been nurtured through the various artist residencies opportunities that since 1993 have developed projects with and for local communities in public space. So although the focus of my research is the residency, I'll also refer to other Palais strands that support a more holistic role and rooting in St Ives. So I'll go through them throughout the presentation. As George said, the fellowship invited me to explore residencies in contexts that echo St Ives, rural, coastal, and peripheral places. And today I'll begin with 3 projects inside Casa Gallina, the ones in red, Grisdale Arts, and Jobida, with a few additional more examples woven in along the way. And while most of these initiatives use the residency format, none are really defined by them or defined by the residency itself. Instead, it becomes a tool for cultivating these reciprocal relationships with the place and the communities around them. So the first case study is Casa Gallina, which emerged from Insight, which is a US-Mexico initiative known for large-scale public art projects. Under Curator Osvaldo Sanchez, the project shifted away from short-term events toward a 6-year process deeply embedded in Santa Maria la Ribera, which is a working-class neighborhood in Mexico City. So unlike previous Insight editions, which spread across cities, Insight Casa Gallina was rooted in one house and in the 16 blocks around it. Before inviting any artist, the team invested in listening and learning. They commissioned 3 contextual studies, a diagnosis of the neighborhood, an ethnographic study of the market, and a collective mapping on gentrification. Not as technical surveys, but much more as acts of relationship building. A community garden and regular workshops extended this ethos, turning arrival into a cyclical practice of care, growth, and reciprocity. The house itself embodied the project values. From the outside, it remained deliberately unmarked, no signage or branding. No press release with curatorial statement was published, kind of resisting the art world's demand for visibility. Inside, a sequence of interlinked rooms encourage encounter and collective life, a garden, an open kitchen, workshops, and shared learning spaces. And upstairs, the artists lived in long-term residencies, often 1 to 3 years, developing works that gradually grew from the relationships formed within the house and across the community. So Casa Gallina functioned not as a gallery, but as a platform for collective production, knowledge exchange, and social engagement. And today, after the end of Insight, Casa Gallina deepened its commitment to linking culture, community, and environment through long-term collaborations with school in the neighborhoods, alliances with grassroots organizations across Mexico, and programs that bridge art, science, and local ecologies, fostering community-led practices between the house, the neighborhood, and across the wider territory. I'll go back to this graphic later on. The second case study is Grisdale Arts, which many of you might know, a contemporary arts organization based at Lawson Park, a restored hill farm in the Lake District. During the 80s and 90s, the Grisdale Society played a major role in British public art, blending the idealism of land art with the populist appeal of outdoor sculpture. When Adam Sutherland became director in 1999, the organization underwent a major shift. Instead of placing art in the landscape, Grisdale began embedding art within the social dynamics of the place, raising critical questions about fragile forms of belonging, second home ownership, and the tensions between tourism and local livelihoods, which are issues that also resonate with St Ives. And this shift provoked controversy and conflict, culminating in locals collectively burning one of Grisdale's own projects, the billboard, after being invited to participate in it. The institutional reconfiguration also sparked a rethinking of the artist residency itself. Residencies evolved into a flexible, community-embedded process. Around 10 artists a year were invited for an initial 3-week research period to listen, meet the residents, and consider how the practice might be useful, with some invited back to deepen these relationships. Today, Lawson Park functions as a working farmhouse with meadows, gardens, and orchards. Its residency program invites artists to live and work on site, collaborating with local communities and sharing responsibility for the land and its maintenance. The third case study is Hobida, a collective based in Topolo, which is a small mountain village in northeastern Italy, right next to the Slovenian border. And it's a small but very complex place that is marked by 2 world wars, by the Cold War, and decades of hostility towards the Slovene minority. And once it was home for 400 inhabitants, and now it has just over 24. So contrary to the other examples, Hobida didn't arrive in the place through an institutional or curatorial plan. Before settling there in 2017, the group of young people and friends from elsewhere had already built ties with the village through the annual festival Stazione di Topolo. So what began as a yearly return gradually became a collective decision to re-inhabit the village, whether to return to a family home or escape the rising costs of living in the city. So you have to imagine a near-empty village with little infrastructure and with houses lacking basic amenities. Routines flowed between different buildings, cooking in one, washing in another, working in a third. So daily life became the basis for commoning, and the village effectively became the house. And care for the built-in natural landscapes signaled the commitment to stay. Their work combines architecture, design, the humanities, and the arts to reimagine cultural and communal life in what they call the post-rural. And for Hobida, residency is a shared, durational practice of living with, where both hosts and guests are transformed. So residents join the seasonal rhythms of the village, share work, maintenance, and communal gatherings, making up a community which is both rooted, made of those who live there, and cyclical, with those that continually come back and return to that place. So, while Casa Galina, the first example, and Grisdale emerge from some sort of institutional reorientation, turning outward to meet the social realities around them, Hobida grew out from inhabiting the place. Thinking about arrival in St Ives means acknowledging a small year-round community living alongside recurring waves of tourists and seasonal workers. What kinds of support, formal and informal, help an artist enter a place with care rather than with a touristic gaze, quote unquote? In St Ives and across Cornwall, this knowledge already exists through individuals, networks, and organizations such as the Visual Arts Southwest and Creative Cairnagh, who George and I have been in conversation throughout this process. And rather than simply supporting incoming artists, could the Palais residency form reciprocal relations with these ecosystems, allowing knowledge and capacity to circulate both ways or in multiple directions? Time, duration, and return matter, yet duration alone does not guarantee depth. At Casa Galina, many artists stayed for less time than what originally planned. As Executive Director Carmen Cuenca noted, this idea of immersion was only partially the case, and she attributes that to the pressures on artistic labor, and on the limits of long-term guesthood. What kinds of temporalities do residencies really need? Continuous presence, cycles of return, or long arcs of relationships that unfold over years? The case studies also offer different ways in how they engage with their communities and position artists within them. So from an aid-oriented ethos that we see in Casa Galina, for example, to unsettling local self-perceptions like Grisdale did. At the Palais, there is a particular attention to groups historically marginalized or with specific access needs. I didn't explain the whole socio-economic dimension of Cornwall, but it's a very complex and delicate one, right? So how can the Palais strengthen local agency without substituting it, speaking for it, or softening it into token participation? In any residency, the artist enters as a kind of foreign agent, bringing different rhythms and sensitivities. As curator Florian Schneider writes, such foreign agency can be generative as it allows the familiar to become strange again, revealing hidden assumptions and new possibilities. So how can this foreign agency be preserved? So how can residencies preserve this capacity to fruitfully unsettle while also cultivating relationships that are grounded in care and reciprocity? Is everyone doing well so far? Okay. So across the 3 case studies, there is an inversion of scales. So the small scale of the institution and the large scale of the place. The house as a village and the neighborhood as the house. This also signals an inversion where domestic rhythms begin to structure institutional life, and institutional infrastructures are reimagined through everyday forms of dwelling and collective care. Going back to the case study. So at Casa Gallina, this inversion was performed through the program, which unfolded through 3 main platforms. So Saberes turned the house into a site of collective learning. Workshops, reading rooms, and training programs used the neighborhood's existing circuits of knowledge and fostered critical reflection, skill sharing, and alternative economies. Under Synergies, the projects nurture alliances that kind of revitalized the neighborhood's imagination and economy. For example, the neighborhood lending library allowed people to borrow tools and appliances, nurturing a small local economy built on sharing. And other initiatives invited collaborations between graphic designers and artists with local shops that led to the redesign of visual identities for local businesses, shopfront shutters, for example. These and other examples together kind of ensure that what happened inside the house continually flowed outwards, redistributing knowledge, strengthening local economies, and rooting the project within the rhythms of the neighborhood. Finally, co-participation was a platform for commissioning new artists through long-term residencies. So artists were invited to immerse themselves in the neighborhood and developed a 2-way process with residents that unfolded over 1 to 3 years. Curator Osvaldo Sanchez described the process of co-participation as the construction of artistic meaning being inseparable from the existential meaning of those who take part of it. For example, Mestizo, a photographic project by Omar Games, challenges dominant ideals of masculine beauty by creating large format portraits of 4 neighbors from Santa Maria la Ribera. Centering their personal histories and self-perception, the project foregrounds mestizo beauty against a culture shaped by Anglo-Saxon standards. The images were installed in major shopping malls and local gyms, offering a striking counterpoint to typical hyper-masculine advertising. Another project, Cynthia Gutierrez, noticed the presence of stained glass windows in the historic architecture of the neighborhood and approached an elementary school to co-create a new piece with its students. So she worked with a local artisan and designed activities in which children explore identity, memory, belonging, and language, and developed a shared visual code. And together they created a large stained glass window installed in the communal areas of the school. And alongside that, the group also led workshops with the whole school, inviting all students to imagine their own designs. In speaking with Josef Ortega, who is Casa Gallina's current director and part of the original Inside team, because Inside has finished, as I explained, and Casa Gallina continues, she noted that there was a gap between the co-participation residencies and the program strands Saberes and Synergies that I presented before. So while Casa Gallina ethos centered on community support and everyday cultural exchange, the broader Inside framework still required a final artwork. And this created tension, even when artistic processes were used to spark collective reflection. The expectation of a discrete end product often pulled the work back toward the art world. That graphic again. So today, Casa Gallina prioritizes the social processes themselves, placing artworks only where they can continue to activate dialogue rather than disappear into circulation. The initiative now is no longer residency-driven. Instead, it collaborates with artists already rooted in their own territories. The core strand of the program now focus on long-term collaborations with local schools, resulting in permanent site-specific works that remain active through ongoing educational and public programs, much like the example that I showed before. In Jobira's work, the boundary between artistic programming, residency, and the everyday maintenance of the village are intentionally blurred. As I explained before, multiple buildings are used as if they were rooms in a single house. But there is an interesting inversion that happens in Izba, their co-working and community space, which functions less like a facility and more like a communal living room. People can read, cook, or gather there, and the keys are available to anyone in the village. In this way, rather than an institution opening itself to the community itself becomes the institution. I don't think the institution is the right word there, but this connects closely to the Palais de Danse's Spaces program, where creative groups and community organizations can inhabit the building as their own. Another example is the Blue House, created by Dutch artist Janne van Heeswijk in a newly built neighborhood in Amsterdam as a residency and community space. Removed from the housing market for 4 years, the house became a living laboratory where invited artists, architects, writers, and thinkers temporarily lived on site and worked directly with residents. The artists in residency, I should put there, were asked to enter the district's emerging social life, as you can see, it was built from scratch, to co-create projects with neighbors and help shape the cultural identity of a place that lacked history, community infrastructure, and shared rituals. Through everyday collaborations such as temporary libraries, communal meals, an open-air cinema, and others, the residency helped kind of catalyze the social ties and test how culture might help a new neighborhood imagine itself into being. This inversion between institution and as neighborhood and neighborhood/village as institution is, of course, not only spatial, but also procedural and infrastructural. And the Palais Liaison Group is an important step in this direction, bringing community members directly into the governance of the Palais. A useful parallel can be found in the Gasworks participation residency in London, and thank you, Jose, for bringing that into my attention. And this 8-month residency connects contemporary art with local communities in Lambeth and Southwark through defined partnerships that you can see over there. And at its heart is a participation advisory board with an evaluation process developed by artist collective Future of the Left. So this process is carried out with community members, not on them, kind of resisting the forms of othering that often shape socially engaged practice. And board members include artists, community representatives, and staff, among others, who meet monthly for real-time discussion and co-evaluation. And because the board continues beyond individual residencies, it helps sustain meaningful connections, both with the communities and with the artists that participated. So these connections can stay long after each artist's project ends. So across the case studies, we see many attempts to move beyond conventional exhibition formats and ask how art can produce social value that is more than symbolic, while also avoiding kind of this aestheticizing places and communities in ways that might fuel exclusion or gentrification. So at Inside Casa Gallina, the project deliberately kept a low profile, avoiding art world visibility and refusing to exhibit residency works inside the house. When artworks were shown, they appeared off-site in places like the Geology Museum, and this ensured that the house remained a lived space of exchange, not a showcase or a catalyst for redevelopment. At Grisdale Arts, the organization shifted away from producing works that kind of clashed with local self-perceptions and instead began entering existing rural formats, country shows, car boot sales, road shows, testing how art could inhabit a context without imposing its own hierarchies. Artists became facilitators rather than auteurs. In a different weekend, for instance, Mark Wallinger ran a face painting stall. And in projects such as Coniston and Creative Egremont, the organization helped facilitate local regeneration through culture by devising ways of working, commissioning, and curating that supported residents' involvement, and ultimately enabled them to take full ownership of both the projects and the artworks themselves. So, for example, in Creative Egremont, Grisdale built on the town's long-standing crab fair, which is a century-old festival featuring competitions like the Greasy Pole. So, for example, here, when safety regulations halted the tradition, artists Jeremy Deller and Alan Kane designed a permanent, insurable greasy pole, not as a symbolic artwork, but as a practical structure that allowed the tradition to return. So this reimagining of local tradition also echoes earlier projects in the Tate St Ives Artists Program, such as Linda Sterling's Your Actions Are My Dreams, which revisited the custom of guys dancing and Cornwall's seasonal rituals. When I spoke to Linda, she noted that the work gave the guys dancers kind of a renewed space at a moment of tension with the council, and that, in a way, collaborating with a high-profile institution such as Tate offered visibility and legitimacy that indirectly helped them sustain that tradition. And Allard van Hoorn's project, rooted in the annual tradition of hurling, kind of reimagined this ritual through an oversized ball that became a playful tool for building bridges between different communities in St Ives, and also tapped into the connective power of play, echoing kind of the spirit of conviviality present in many of the Grisdale projects that I showed you before. And this raises important questions for the Palais Community Connection strand, which seeks to create gatherings, festivals, and pop-ups in local, rooted in local heritage. So how might these moments move beyond symbolic insertions of art into them and become catalysts for shared authorship, agency, and communal ownership? So what distinguishes Grisdale? It's a sustained turn towards art-related rather than art-specific practices. As art theorist Stephen Wright described, such practices operate with a double ontology. They are what they are, a festival, a structure, a social process, and simultaneously there are proposals of what art can become. As Adam Sutherland puts it, the aim was to be a constructive influence, enabling people to take on the ambition of the work and define its future, even when that future diverged completely from the artist's or institution's intentions. So this requires embracing a loss of control, passing authorship to others, and seeing value not only in the outcomes, but in the slow and often messy labor of making things together. So other residency projects use artistic practice and community collaboration as a way to sustain indigenous knowledge and support ongoing processes of land reclamation. These could be 2 lectures. I'm going to very briefly go through them with the pain in my heart that I'm not doing justice. Anyway, so Sakya Art, Science and Agriculture, where Gabriella was a resident in, is a community-embedded residency in Ain Kenia in Palestine, which revives abandoned buildings and agricultural terraces as sites for artistic, ecological, and communal learning. Founded by artist Nida Sinokrot and architect Sahar Khawazmi, Sakya brings together artists, researchers, farmers, and local stewards of land into coexistence. The residency is devoted to recovering agrarian knowledge and architectural heritage threatened by occupation, the ongoing genocide, and environmental degradation. So through collective farming, workshops, and site-specific projects, Sakya functions as a living school, but also as a form of cultural resistance, using art to protect and reactivate practices at risk of erasure. A parallel approach appears in Makotai Eco Art Village, a community-led residency in the indigenous Makotai territory in Taiwan. Good entrance. Created after a 30-year struggle that resulted in the return of ancestral land in 2020. So the residency is rooted in this act of reclamation and uses art to rebuild relationships between land, culture, and everyday life. So the artists learn from indigenous knowledge, keepers and stewards, and participate in communal practices from handicrafts to coastal stewardship, positioning art as part of a broader ecology of environmental and communal care. Third example in Taiwan, the Taroko Arts Residency, unfolds in an ancestral land of the indigenous Siharai community in Taroko National Park, which are remote villages without electricity, where few families remain after decades of state-driven displacement. And here, a group of indigenous women collectively lead the residents in dialogue with curator Cheng Tao Chen. So they select artists, shape the projects, and decide how resources are used. So together, these projects create forms of cohabitation that empower, even protect, or maybe reactivate vulnerable knowledge systems. So can the thresholds that the residencies inhabit enable forms of exchange that sustain rather than aestheticize or appropriate local knowledge, allowing art to contribute to the ongoing cultural life of a place rather than overwrite it? Another example I'll only touch on briefly, but I'm sure many of you know this, is Inland Campo Adentro in Spain, founded by artist and agroecologist Fernando Garcia Dori, which treats the rural as a site of knowledge, resistance, and institutional invention or reinvention. So alongside farmers and shepherds, artists are included there, kind of engaging in agroecological training, but also food production and land access initiatives, but also transnational policy networks. So as you can see here, Inland is structured as sort of para-institution that operates through interconnected layers of training, production, economy, and network building. So here it's interesting to see how residencies can coexist, but also can nurture these forms of institution building that are also going through not only the artistic, but the economical, the policy, advocacy sides of institutions. In these examples, we see a shift towards rethinking the very structures through which art is commissioned, produced, and sustained, opening those structures to, let's say, a shared decision-making rather than keeping them within institutional hands. And a model that pushes this even further is the New Patrons, initiated in France in the 90s by artist François Zerre. Whoops. So in this model, citizens, not curators, not institutions, commission artworks in response to issues that matter to them. So anyone in civil society can become a patron, individually or collective. And since the program began, more than 400 projects have been initiated by farmers, students, doctor, activists, and many others. So patrons are asked to articulate why the work matters and why collective investment in it is justified. This clicker. So citizens afterwards meet with a mediator, which is another word for curator, kind of to articulate their concerns and draft a project brief together. The mediator then proposes artists who resonate with the brief, and the citizens choose the artist. The artist meets the group and develops a proposal, refined through discussion until it's approved. And once agreed, the mediator mobilizes permissions and funding, and the work is carried out. These models kind of reframe the question from procedure to power. Who decides what matters? Who has the right to bring an issue into public life through the lens of art? And in a way, the new patron shows us that, to commission collectively is already to rehearse living together to some extent, testing forms of shared responsibility, negotiation, and mutual accountability. So the democratic question then becomes not how many voices are consulted, but whether the cultural process truly redistributes who gets to define the terms of engagement and who continues shaping meaning once the project ends. If community take a leading role in shaping and validating artistic work, how might this unsettle long-held assumptions about expertise, artistic autonomy, or even what counts as quality? And conversely, how do we avoid reducing artistic practice to consensus building or to benevolent forms of community service? This connects to a longer history of residencies, placing artists inside civic and institutional spheres and systems, from the artist placement group in the 60s to contemporary initiatives like New York Public Artists in Residence or the UK Manifest Policy Lab, which embed artists in governmental structures to rethink public life from within. So such developments also reveal the ambivalence of these approaches. So artists can be instrumentalized to fulfill predetermined agendas, yet the same embedded situations can create rare openings where artistic thinking might unsettle assumptions, complicate institutional logic, and expand what kinds of imaginaries can enter the public sphere. So these examples kind of became catalysts for shared reflections with the Tate St Ives team and the community members that I've encountered in St Ives. And they help us think collectively about the Palais de Danse and, most importantly, its future relationship with the town. This fellowship does not mark the end of the research. The research, in many ways, will continue within my wider project, Threshold Institutional Liminal Practices, where I'm also looking not only into artist residency formats, but other institutional formats and curatorial strategies and artistic strategies that kind of reinforce meaningfully these connections between art, place, and people, let's say. And it's research supported by the Mondrian Funds in the Netherlands. Many thanks to the Rory and Elizabeth Brooks Foundations, to Tate and to Delphina Foundation for their support, and to all the other institutions and individuals, many of them here, many of them watching this recording afterwards, for their time and contribution. And thank you for enduring.
Thanks. That was great.
7:30, 7:33.
Yeah, we're doing all right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bruno. Such a rich and full range of very different case studies and examples. It's really brilliant to see and to hear about them in such detail. I was also reminded, as we're seeing some of those pictures, it reminded me of seeing Hepworth and her contemporaries, and the creative community that existed at the time that she was alive. It made me think about, we're in a position in St Ives where we're maybe trying to reinstate something that already existed and is part of the heritage, but we're in a different time slot. And also we're a national gallery, so we are potentially part of the challenge of, attracting tourism, which is, potentially a barrier to achieving some of that. So there's that catch-22, and I'm interested to ask you, we will open up for questions if people have them, but to start that, I wanted to ask you, in lots of the examples, they are, many are either artist-led or were artist-initiated in some way, which is obviously quite different to the context that I'm working in. So I'm interested to know why you were drawn to those and what you feel, what learning that brings through looking at those in terms of the role that artist has.
Yeah, I think from early on in our conversation, even in the process of interviewing, I was very clear with the projects that excited me and with the things I was already developing. So many of these case studies I was already in conversation with from previous projects. But I also understood from you that you as a team and the purpose of this fellowship was less to reiterate the knowledge that you already have, because obviously the Palais and the framework and the project is already quite well defined and thought through, and you have a lot of local expertise, but also knowledge around similar institutions and what similar institutions to Tate are doing in different parts of the world. So I didn't want this research to add the same elements in that equation. I wanted to bring things that couldn't be so easily transferable one-to-one to the frameworks that exist at Tate, but because of that could open new avenues for thinking and new possibilities. Sometimes not, we ran out of battery. This is how long I've spoken for. So I wanted to bring those more oblique entry points and see what generates from there. I don't bring these case studies as best case examples of what art has to be. Far from that. I think we selected together these through conversation and to what resonated and could trigger some discussions in the place. And there were many other examples that I didn't mention that are super relevant. Many of those examples are not about really institutional building, are much more about artistic practice, because I feel kind of the artists are always at the forefront and then the institution kind of paces behind them in a way. So those were the motivations. I didn't want to bring something that was already on the table. I think the value of having someone fresh and also not so knowledgeable about Tate or about St Ives and will not become knowledgeable in 6 months under these circumstances. I think the even more honest approach is to just bring other case studies to the mix and see what that generates without also pretending to be an expert in any of these. And I think with that, and you've seen in my presentation, I'm not proposing a model. I'm not proposing, there are just more questions or reflections, or they're triggers to be discussed with you and with the community there and with whoever is interested. But I don't think the model was a goal for our conversation, or the certainty was, our ambition. It was much more the speculation.
Thank you. I'm really conscious of time, so I've got lots of questions, but I wonder if anyone else has a question before I ask another. Oh, one microphone.
Shall I introduce myself briefly? Stephen Bennett, I run the Policy Lab in the UK, and I'm a practicing artist. So we are running the Manifest programme. So I'd love to get your thoughts on what you've taken from your research and how that might be applied from a context where a team is bringing artists into government. So it's a slightly different context, I appreciate that, but I'm sure I've been taking lots of photos, I'm sure there's some really transferable pieces there. And then a sort of thought, I think there's a really interesting thing about value and I've been in situations as an artist where I've been in residencies and I felt quite abstracted. So the team wanted something out of me, but actually that's sort of quite good because they really wanted something. I've seen residencies where an artist has definitely sort of extracted something, and that's been quite an attractive process. And I think there's maybe something about co-design, which is maybe not a word we'd use in these circles so much, but it's one that we use in Policy Lab a lot, about sort of mutual development or creation of value could be quite interesting. So a couple of thoughts there would be interesting to read.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think the artist placement group is such a great wealth of knowledge and good example to go more in depth, which I couldn't go during this residency, but it's definitely on my list. And we have Mary there, who works at the Flat Time House, who continues that legacy in many ways. Where to start? You've asked so many good questions. Well, I think I work in a residency in the Netherlands, and I feel the contract with the artist, not the literal contract, but the reason why the artist goes there and what is expected from them has to be clear. And to illustrate that, with one of the case studies in Casa Gallina, speaking with Josef Ortega, and understanding this shift that they now work with artists that are working in the territories for many, many years. So they have decided not to bring someone else or ask them to do something site-specific or in response to an existing community, but rather to include those who are already working in the place. And it's a solution that worked with them, and they have very clear coordinates of what is their interests. So there's this social, communal, and environmental aspect. There's this connection to science, and like with the Geology Museum and partnerships with scientists. So the ethos of the institution is very clear. So it's not something that is easily shifted with a specific partnership or a specific, well, I'm assuming, I don't know so much in depth. I think sometimes the problem is when the ethos of the institution is not clear and it floats with a specific funding that you have, that comes with temporalities, that comes with values, that comes with interests, or with shifting institutional agendas. So there are many layers there, but I feel this is kind of this ethos of the institution already establishes a starting point, a common ground where the artist and the institution can work from a place of informed, reciprocal exchange. And then I think, like from a curatorial point of view, also selecting artists is a very delicate process, because it's not just selecting someone who has an affinity with a place or familiarity with a place, but it's also understanding where the artist is at their moment in their career, which is something that can be informed by conversation, but sometimes in selection processes of residencies through an open call, for example, which is, we discussed like these selection processes too in this fellowship. It's hard to understand that from an application. But I think when you choose an artist, and not only the work and the capacity to deliver is there, but also the right timing for the artist to be in that space and time. I think it's telling that in Casa Gallina and during the Insight, they had this infrastructure to support artists to stay there for a long time. And then ultimately, that wasn't the case for all. And maybe that wasn't to the detriment of the projects, but it's just sometimes these assumptions of duration and welcoming people can backlash because maybe it's not the right moment for the artist to be there. And then another question is how artists say no to opportunities when there's such a scarcity. So, but that's an endless conversation. But just to give you a few hints. Anyone else would like the microphone?
Right, thank you. My name is Katrin, artist. I wanted to thank you. I wanted to thank you really for immense trust in practice. And I think when your question came of like, how is that relatable to Tate, to the institution, at a museum, how does Drysdale relate? I just thought, oh my God, you really followed the learning through practice in those organizations. It's really, I think that for me is the message. And then what are the new things that have been tried out, and they've been tried out, therefore they're also scalable. You know, if I see Gasworks with their incredible work suddenly having a participatory advisory group, I'm like, wow, that's learning. Nick, the good idea. Tate can do that. You know, it doesn't have to be a small organization. So in that moment, I felt there was like a huge trust in practice and learning from it, and remaining excited about how new ideas open up new ways. So it's not a matter of scale. I think it's about excitement. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh,
there we go.
Erin.
Thank you, Bruno, for such an inspiring talk. You mentioned this argument, like, or more than like a question, like how can maybe artists like intervene into a context without or like residencies without imposing the hierarchies of the art system, and that like really hit like a spot. It's just like painfully true. So my question is more like, has there been maybe positive examples of like, for instance, like the Gasworks example was really amazing, how like it changes the system also of the hosting institution in a way. But I'm just thinking, yeah, like in your research, have you also encountered other situations, maybe through hosting like different artists, maybe that really shaped the hierarchies of the hosting institutions, working more as a whole? Because this to me sounds like, okay, yeah, there is like an advisory group that's external to the system. It's part of the system, but I just wonder whether there's more radical case studies. They're asking a lot.
Yeah, but that's from scratch. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Erin. That's a good question. It makes me think. Because I think, well, the new patrons does that, but it's not like there's an existing institution and then the artist come and reshuffles all of that. Like from the beginning, the artist is put at a later stage because what they want to reshape is the who gets to formulate the question. But I feel with big institutions, like I know several projects that have managed to take small baby steps. I'm also suspicious of like the artist is coming and changes everything. Like what does that mean? We know institutional change doesn't happen overnight. And if it happens overnight, then one might be suspicious about what has actually changed, right? But in that sense, so I have no radical proposals, but I can think of many like baby steps and in many different ways, because I feel the examples that I've showed are very community oriented and socially engaged in that sense, but I feel sometimes you don't even need to work with the community so collaboratively to be socially engaged or to be efficient in addressing the institution or the place. And I could illustrate that with another presentation, many other examples, right? Because in my practice, I've also never really worked with communities like you have, George. Mm-hmm. And I still feel like there was some sort of contribution to making something more permeable, making these different spheres more permeable. But, I can remember the Van Abbe Museum is a good example in the Netherlands of this institutional recalibration through artistic practice, through projects. There's a project from Decolonizing Art and Architecture, Alessandro and Sandy, who did this, I think the project's called The Living Room. And there's a whole story behind it that I won't be able to explain in detail, but it's basically creating in the museum space, a space where people can just meet, especially focusing on people who are living in Eindhoven as refugees or recent migrants, and they can inhabit that space as a living room. So this is a very simple, and that project has happened in Sweden, it has happened in different places. So something as simple as that, institutionally, it's disrupting something there. So I feel looking at those type of examples that are triggering like some little things, And then, of course, you have like with the work of Catherine, our cooking sections. You have like a whole new, or many others who might be here and I haven't pointed to you. You have a whole different understanding of that same question, where the artists are kind of co-opting, I don't know if that's the right term, sorry, these institutional frameworks to their own ends to a certain extent. So I think that's also doing that in a very radical way, but might be always in the backstage or infrastructurally. So you might not perceive that as a radical gesture, but it's much more in the politics of things. But I think maybe Danielle and Alon and Catherine and Jose or many other artists in the room could give us a better answer.
Can I speak from the position of an organisation? That I think a lot of the examples that you shared speak of time in a different way to perhaps the cycle of the organisation experiences time. So for me, there's something very radical in that, particularly around the idea, or particularly the larger the organisation perhaps, there's something very radical around, it sounds very simple, but things being properly committed to over time or being revisited, the idea of return. I think in the examples you've shared, there's some really radical examples of a commitment to that. And I also wanted to ask you maybe in some of the examples in terms of like the duty of care to the artist or how care is considered, which example you feel may be best to demonstrate a kind of commitment to looking after the artist or holding the artist?
I think all of them in different ways, because in Hobida it's just these affective ties that already exist and people are drawn to the place without any funding or institutional backup, but because they need to be there and it's part of their work and their life. So there's this, it's indissociable, this work and life. And then I love how Casa Gallina is very caring for the community for sure, and I guess for the artists as well. But in a way, I also like how, at least reading, I haven't met Adam yet, but read the book about Grisdale, and you can feel this, there's something recalcitrant and acid and like there, that maybe that's not what most people think of a caring institutional position towards artists. But I think maybe it might be too, because I think in a way it's endorsing also the practice. Despite the controversy and the conflicts with whatever self-perceptions there were in that place, in a brave way, from what I perceive from an outside perspective. So I think there are different ways of caring, and what I've learned through working at the Jan van Eyck is that you have a framework, but then the framework guarantees a baseline that you can kind of establish conditions that are comfortable for everyone, hopefully, but then it's much more case to case in the communication, in everything. So it's an impossible task, and it depends on who you're dealing with. So that's why I also brought Grisdale, because I love that acidity, and then in Casa Gallina is something a bit more sweet and more.
I think we might have time for one more.
One more, okay.
Yeah.
Hey Bruno, it was really wonderful to learn about so many new residencies that I never knew before in depth. And I was just really wondering if you could share what their business model, or like how they sustain themselves financially. Is it more of the grassroots or is it more of the public funding? I'm just asking this because a lot of initiatives like these are dying away because of the financial struggles. And in order for it to be scalable and sustainable, I think having full understanding of financial needs is also really grateful. So, yeah.
I'm just going to focus on the three main. Yes. So Hobida, as far as I know, doesn't have structural funding. The funding comes through specific projects. and they've received an European Creative Europe grant. And I know that they're working with the municipality, but I don't know if that necessarily has some economic return there. But it's a bit more patchy, and they live and work in that space. So it's that economy too. Casa Gallina. So the period I presented to you there was during Insight, and Insight is this big biannual and binational event. So the funding came from there, and now Casa Gallina has some philanthropic foundations supporting them. It was interesting to talk to Josefa and also understand what is the influence now with the current politics in the United States, the funding pressure that exerts in institutions like Casa Gallina, because they have depended on this binational funding system. And we also discuss new ways of diversifying funding streams, because their mission is also very much pedagogical and scientific and ecological and community. So they are diversifying now, like the different pots of money where they can grow. And Grisdale, you might know this better than I do, but I think Grisdale is publicly funded. But yeah, most likely not 100%. So I guess partnerships and maybe a little bit of own income, but I don't know. The study of Grisdale was based mostly in the beginning years of Adam there. I know there's much more to explore now, but it felt like this friction that they produce with the place could bring a good balance to the other examples I brought. Thank you, everyone. Sarah will say the final words.
So, thank you, George. Thank you so much, Bruno. We've benefited in many, many ways from having Bruno in residence for the last 6 months with us, and we are going to miss you. So thank you so much for being part of our Delphina family for the last 6 months. Thank you to Elizabeth and Rory Brooks. Thank you to all our colleagues at Tate. This has been a 10-year partnership. We are advertising for the next round of fellows at the moment. Please take a look, recommend it to anyone you think might be a good candidate. We love hosting them. We always learn so much. And the last lot of thank yous is to all of you for coming on such a cold and rainy night. Thank you so much for coming here and spending time with us. We've got about 5-10 minutes. Finish your wine, catch up with people, and then we're going to kick you out. I'm afraid we have to give the house back to the residents, but there is an excellent pub around the corner if you want to continue the evening. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bruno.
Thank you.